Pre-flop, you opened to 2.5 big blinds, and then big blind 3-bet to 13 big blinds, and you simply called. On the flop, this opponent checked, and now you are holding king jack of clubs and deciding what to do. As a very broad simplification, on high boards as button versus big blind, our best strategy is to use this 30% pot size bet around 50% of the time with our range. We'll start with how our strongest hands play. Our 2 pairs plus are betting around 70% of the time. Our overpairs are going to be very rare on high boards, but we can just always bet them when we have them. And then our top pairs are betting between 30 to 80% of the time, depending on their strength. Stronger top pairs will bet more often, as we'll see in just a second. Let's dive into a specific board to see these hands in action. We are looking at button strategy on Ace King 7 Rainbow. This is the same board from earlier. So just highlighting these strongest hands, you can see that sets and 2 pairs are mostly betting, but there definitely is a little bit of slow playing happening. Slow playing usually comes from any sets or 2 pairs that interact with that top pair card. Ace 7 is sometimes checking, pocket aces is checking quite often, but King 7 and pocket 7s are always betting. And that's going to be the case for most boards. Next up, let's take a look at our top pairs. You can see that our strongest top pairs, Ace Queen and Ace Jack, are betting very often, but then it sort of levels off and decreases as we get into like the Ace 5, Ace 4, etc. Just like with our second pairs, it's still important to bet these weaker top pairs at a small frequency, but obviously our stronger ones are betting a lot more often. It's very important to note that these hands are still sometimes checking, and this is again just to balance out that checking range and prevent our opponent from exploiting the weaker hands in our range. Let's take a look at how those weaker hands play. So second pairs will bet around 30% of the time, and low pairs will also bet around 30% of the time, except that we can now bluff with very weak combos a little bit more often. On Ace King 7, this is quite clear, so our second pairs are betting around 20% of the time, the stronger ones are again betting a little bit more, just like the top pairs, and then the third pairs and low pairs are still betting around 30% of the time, but there is a very clear pattern to be discussed here. When we look at these hands, usually these stronger pocket pairs will have a preference towards checking, and we're only starting to bet hands like pocket 8s or 7-6, pocket 6s, just generally the weaker ones. A lot of this has to do with equity denial, because these hands can definitely deny a lot more equity than something like pocket jacks. But we also start to run into this threshold where our hands like pocket 6s and pocket 5s aren't really clear showdown value hands. We're starting to get into bluffing territory because these pairs are so weak. Especially when the board has 2 Broadway cards on it, it's quite difficult for us to have a lot of bluffs here because the ace definitely makes the top pair, the king makes the second pair, so where do our bluffs really come from? And in this scenario, the solver will actually start bluffing with hands like pocket 5s, pocket 4s, and pocket 3s quite often. Diving into our bluffs, the note I have written here says that everything without showdown value bets around 50% of the time, and our best bluffs can bet a little bit more often. That's definitely the case on Ace King 7. As I mentioned, we don't really have too many bluffs because the ace and the king are blocking a lot of our air, right? So instead of having like King 10 that is just king high, King 10 is second pair on this board. So the bluffs that we do have end up betting quite often. Queen Jack is betting, obviously that's a draw, so it's quite easy to understand. But even hands like Jack 9 of hearts are betting at a very, very high frequency. Typically, more connected combos like Queen Jack will bet a lot more often, but also combos that are just lower in this part of our range are going to bet a bit more often. If you think about the blockers of these hands like 6-5 and 5-4, they're really not blocking a lot of folds. If we take a look at how our opponent plays in response versus the small bet, the majority of their folds are coming from hands like pocket jacks, pocket 10s, Queen 9, Jack 9, and although 5-4 does not have a draw here, it at least does not block those folds. I like to think of this as kind of like a reverse L pattern, because if you just draw out the blockers of 5-4, it's going to block these hands and these ones, but it entirely misses like this region of our opponent's range. I think that's a pretty intuitive way of thinking about it. Just one final point about that showdown value. I switched the board over to Queen 7-3 flush draw, and if we select those hands, you will see that the stronger ace highs are not really bluffing. This is what I meant when I said in the notes that anything without showdown value bluffs, hands like ace 10 and ace jack, have showdown value, so they're inclined to check a little bit more often. But again, just like the second pairs or third pairs, these hands are still betting sometimes in order to not have an exposed checking range.